Hey everybody, Josh Sigurdsson of World Alternative Media here, and we are joined here in Las Vegas, Nevada at Freedom Fest by none other than Dan Johnson. Nice to finally
Good to see you,
talk
man.
to you on video. I saw you at the Red Pill Expo, and it's interesting because there's not a lot of people out there our age, I mean, you're quite young, I'm quite young, that are doing what we are trying to accomplish, and it's always good to meet other people close to my age who are so passionate about the message of individual liberty and just freedom in general. So I wanted to...
Can I speak to that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
As to, because I get asked this question a lot. Being a young person, I'll have, older people come up to me and be like, why aren't you kids more involved in the politics, right? And I think there's two main reasons why young people don't get involved in politics. Number one is, can you actually make a difference, right? Can you actually, if you go to your city council meeting, like I did, when I first started Panda, I went to my city council meeting and my mayor literally told me to go back to basic government class. And so you get this response of, okay, either you can't make a difference, right? Or if you start to get involved, nobody treats you like an equal. Nobody treats you like you actually have any ideas. I think the big difference between, say, the Ron Paul revolution, right, and some other political campaigns is the revolution went to young people and go, you have some ideas, we're not just gonna make you canvas and knock on doors. So I think if we can address both of those things, we'll see more young people, and the people who are addressing both of those things will have more young people surrounding them. We aren't as rare as you might think.
Absolutely, and I've noticed that. I mean, most people are afraid to speak about what they believe because they are afraid that, they're going to have conflicting arguments with people that they respect and they don't want to lose friends and family, etc. But it comes down to we need to be louder because the left is incredibly loud. In fact, they kind of hurt my ears, when you go out to certain events where it's just like screeching and hollering about collectivism and how great it is. And I think it's important that we have a counter to that and in a peaceful manner explain to people, look, you have good intentions, but this is the issue with that, and this is what the end goal is for myself. This is what my agenda is. What is yours, etc. But moving on from that, obviously you started Panda, and it was People Against a National Defense Authorization Act, and the NDAA is one of the most Orwellian things to come upon the United States of America in a long time. I mean, obviously the Patriot Act was terrible, but the NDAA is like an add-on to the Patriot Act that's alarming to anyone that actually truly understands what it entails. So can you go into why you started Panda and what your agenda is as someone who's trying to get the message out on the NDAA?
So absolutely. So I actually didn't feel like getting involved in politics. I didn't want to. Poly being many and ticks being blood-sucking creatures. It doesn't sound like the area I generally want to be involved in. But I realized over time that all of our futures are so interwoven in politics, that politics really means who gets what, when, where, and how. And it is the process of influence, essentially. And so I decided I was going to take political science at Bowling Green State University. I was going to go the normal route, which means I was going to join up the Republican Party, run for city council, run for county commission, state representative, run for Congress, take a few bribes, retire on an island, right? Sounded like a great, career. Sure. And I came across a video on the 2012 NDAA called 61 Senators Betrayed You Today. And I remember thinking, I grew up in a very Republican household. The only thing that was wrong with the country was Obama, and he was going to take our guns. Senators are betraying me? What about John McCain? He's my hero. And wow. I'm serious. He was a role model I looked up to. Someone who's esteemed senior senator, stuff like that, right? Sure. So I saw this video, and Senator Lindsey Graham is on the Senate floor saying,
and when they say, I want my lawyer, you tell them, shut up.
Your time is expired.
Get a lawyer.
And it was like, and if you're even thinking about joining Al-Qaeda, then we'll have a drone over your head. You can face death, detention, and prosecution. I don't know if they're supposed to be in that order. But, I was seeing these things, and then I was seeing people like Judge Andrew Napolitano go, this is turning America into a battlefield and into a police state. And I remember thinking, I had, being homeschooled, I had avoided the government indoctrination centers of public school, and I had studied the rise and fall of the Third Reich. And the rise and fall of several other nations as well, but particularly that. And the enabling acts that were passed by Hitler shortly after the Reichstag fire decree, and the fire decree itself, they essentially gave Hitler unlimited dictatorial power and put the military in as a policing force in Germany. And the last two things that dictators do before the country is what we would consider an autocracy or a dictatorship, is they militarize and they federalize the police forces. I saw this happening in Germany. I was like, okay, well, these are the last 2 steps. Literally, there are provisions in the Reichstag Fire Decree that directly line up with the 2012 National Defense Authorization Acts, 1021 and 1022. And I was looking at these provisions going, all right, this is a real problem. And if this actually exists, then this is something I need to do something about. And I remember spent about a month and a half researching the issue, fighting people on Twitter about it, and really engaging and getting to understand, I want to be on the right side of history here.
Absolutely.
And in January, I decided, let's go fight it. At least in my time, I never thought, people think, oh yeah, you run a national organization. I never thought I would be doing that. And if somebody had said, hey Dan, you're going to fight the NDAA all across the country at 18, I'd have been like, haha, no, I'll see you later. But I really saw that I could do something in my city, right? So I gathered up a bunch of people. I gathered like 25 people or so, young Republicans, Occupy, Bowling Green, Libertarian Party. We all came together in this meeting. We packed the city council room, and we simply asked for them to say, no, the military will not have the authority to detain you in this city. We will not allow that to happen without a charge or a trial. And they basically said, go home. Go back to government class, little boy. Pat me on the head, right? And it was at that point, Robert Frost talks about the road less traveled by. I took the road less traveled by, and it's made all the difference. And it was at that point I went, I could quit. I could go back to college. My grades were sagging a little bit because of the time I was spending on that fight. I could just do this, go the normal way, or I could tell the guy, the mayor, who happens to be named Dick. I'm not, implying anything there.
Of course.
But Dick Edwards, and I was like, or I could prove him wrong. And that's really what launched Panda. And really, if you want to look into the dangers of this legislation, in 1942, people talk about internment camps in Germany and like, oh, this is so terrible that Hitler did it. And arguably, the concentration camps in Germany were much worse than the internment camps here. But, we detained 120,000 Japanese Americans without a charge or without a trial. And the law that led to that, Executive Order 9066, that law doesn't say anything about detention. It doesn't say anything about imprisonment. In fact, it says the Secretary of War shall have, they called it war back then, Secretary of War instead of Secretary of Defense. I think it was more accurate. But the Secretary of War shall have exclusive jurisdiction over certain areas of the country. The military will have jurisdiction over certain areas of the country, and we detain 120,000 people. The 2012 National Defense Authorization Act applies that exact same authority here in this country, and it's not just an executive order signed by the president. It was passed by Congress, 283 to 136 in the House, and 93 to 7 in the Senate.
And let's not forget that it was signed at almost near midnight on December 31st, I believe 2011, which is a little odd because that's when no one's watching the news, right? That's when everyone's out partying, that's when everyone's out having fun, and then they have a few days to recover and they don't watch anything that's going on, and then at that point it's old news, so let's not talk about it.
Well, it also happens with a lot of bills, right? Anytime they, the CISPA was introduced during the NFL draft, for example. Like, anytime they want to do this, they try a holiday, and New Year's Eve, everybody's drinking, and everybody's likely to forget what they were drinking, among other things, the next day. And yeah, he signed it on December 31st, New Year's Eve. It was actually passed on Bill of Rights Day in the Senate. It basically says that, the war on terror that we authorized around the world, that you thought only applied to brown people in turbans. Actually, it applies to American citizens, and it applies to American citizens here at home. The world is a battlefield, including the homeland. When you see something like that, it's a watershed moment in a country's history. It's the point where most of what Hitler did was legal. They passed the law first, they justify it by an emergency, and then he continued to do it. And this was a watershed moment for me, and that's really what led to the foundation of Panda.
Well, and it's an incredible organization, and it's just so important because, even just recently, the rehashing of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is, by the way, almost overwhelmingly supported by both parties, which just goes to show that two-party paradigm. we saw just recently the fake news kind of provision to the National Defense Authorization Act, which seems to try and silence individual, like mostly independent journalists who are basically using their free speech to, in some cases, say their opinion, in some cases say the truth, and in some cases say some pretty stupid things. There's always a mixture, as there is in any field. But using this, using the National Defense Authorization Act, they're attempting to silence people, whether they're right or wrong, in the independent media world, just by calling them fake news and saying they are dangerous to the status quo, they're dangerous to society as a whole, and this is something that should worry a lot of people, because as we've seen about only a 6% rate of trust for the mainstream media today, there are people running towards independent medias because they are sick of being lied to. And it's perfect timing that, here comes the NDAA to save humanity from itself once again. But what do you think about this new provision?
Well, the National Defense Authorization Act has been around for 50 plus years.
Yeah.
It was, George Washington warned against having a standing army because he knew that eventually they would take more and more and more authority. Mm-hmm. And the National Defense Authorization Act is the standing army bill. It funds the military every single year. And a lot of the provisions are strictly dedicated to that. Mm-hmm. But over time, it became a must-pass bill, that if you're a senator and you voted against the NDAA, your opponent would headline your state and go, they voted against funding the troops. Mm-hmm. No matter what's in there, doesn't matter the provision, they voted against funding the troops. Mm-hmm. And so people just automatically reflex. They vote for the NDAA, they don't read it. And, now I don't in any way say that this gives them some sort of leeway, or this gives them some sort of string that, you're scot-free. You didn't look. If you didn't read it, you're incompetent. If you read it and you passed it anyway, you're a traitor. Yeah. At the end of the day, those are two things that I don't want my representative to be, and you don't deserve to be in office for that. But that is how they got past, the 2012 version, the world's a battlefield, and what you're talking about, which is basically it starts out. They always start out as a commission. Right, so it creates the commission on looking into Russia's influence on the media, sure. And it starts to look into, okay, what should the State Department do, what should the government do, and then back in 2015, the 2015 NDAA erased the Smith-Mundt Act, and the Smith-Mundt Act was to prevent U.S. propaganda like Voice of America from being broadcast here on U.S. soil. And of course, now we can do that, and now the government can do that. So it is really dangerous. I do focus, though, on the battlefield provisions, because you don't. Let me take your audience through a little bit of a history, if you don't mind, right? So in 2000, at the Geneva Conventions, prior to 2000, the Geneva Conventions, under the laws of war, there are two categories of people. There are combatants and non-combatants, right? So if you're a combatant, you're under some sort of military arm, you have a uniform, you have things like that. And if you're a non-combatant, you're basically everybody else. Both categories, because of the horrors of World War II, prohibit torture. Both categories prohibit, extrajudicial execution, once they're unarmed or they're not a direct threat. And after 2001, the United States government didn't particularly care for that restriction very much. So they created a new category of person called unlawful enemy combatant. And an unlawful enemy combatant wasn't a combatant. You still had to be in service, some military branch or group or whatever. But you could be tortured, you could be killed, you had no rights, right? You were basically an enemy spy if they had caught an enemy spy. And that was in 2006 or so. Then they look at, well, we don't really like that term either, because that requires them to be a combatant. Why don't we include the non-combatants? So they renamed the term unprivileged enemy belligerent. And now that includes non-combatants. So now they used the combatant, unlawful combatant, to torture the alleged 9/11 hijackers in Guantanamo Bay. And they used the unprivileged enemy belligerent to kill Anwar al-Awlaki in 2011, an American citizen who happened to be living in Yemen. He was born in Colorado, and his son. A 16-year-old Colorado kid who liked to play Pokemon. And hadn't seen his dad in 2 years, Abdurrahman al-Awlaki. And now they're applying that exact same power. The term belligerent act is in the 2012 NDAA. They're applying that exact same power here in the United States. You can be treated like Anwar al-Awlaki and like Abdurrahman al-Awlaki. That's the danger of the 2012 NDAA.
And of course, Anwar al-Awlaki, I always mess up his name, he obviously did have some extreme views that were terrible in a lot of people's opinions, in my opinion. But with that said, to drone bomb someone without any due process, without any warrant, to drone bomb people in period, in my opinion, but I mean, to just do it without any extrajudicial process laid out in front, and then just killing his son by guilt by association. And then I believe it was Robert Gibbs who said in an interview with Luke Rudowski of We Are Change, or one of the reporters from We Are Change, that, well, he shouldn't have been related to his father then if he didn't want to die.
Well, and speaking to that point, right, there is only one crime that a definition of evidence is defined in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. One crime, treason. Mm-hmm. And the reason why that crime, which requires literally a confession in open court, mm-hmm. or the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act, mm-hmm.
The
reason the bar is set so high for treason is because the British used to hang the founders, like Nathan Hale and people like that, on no trial, on no charges, and on merely suspicion. And when we break the doctrine of allegiance and protection, when you're an American citizen, part of the perk of being an American citizen is you are making an agreement with the government. Yeah. You will protect me even if I'm in a foreign country. And when we violate that because we're scared, we open the door to the very abuses that the founders literally fought against from the beginning. And these arguments from these politicians and these national security experts that, oh, well, unlucky you were the son of somebody we didn't like, as a reason why we should be able to execute an American citizen overseas, and that, quite frankly, on U.S. soil as well. Those should be concerning, I think, to Americans.
Well, where are we at in this fight? It's 2017. Obviously, as you mentioned, it's been around for about 50 years. Where are we at in actually taking down the National Defense Authorization Act? Because something tells me I don't think Donald Trump is going to be too much of a hope for getting rid of it.
Okay, so I can't speak to the president's ambitions or motivations. I know there are members of his cabinet who are not fond of the 2012 NDAA. And I do want to make the distinction. This is the detention provisions of the 2012 NDAA, not the whole National Defense Authorization Act. I'm not saying let's go defund the whole military. What I am saying is these detention provisions they violate 14 provisions of usually the U.S. Bill of Rights and whatever state constitution is involved, at least 5 different amendments of the Bill of Rights. Where we're at is Rand, we've, as PANDA, we fought it on a local level. So coast to coast, we got the Albany, New York to pass legislation against it saying, you come in here, it's a prosecutable offense for you to come after our people. Same thing with several cities in Idaho, counties in Idaho, things like that. We've done that coast to coast. On the national level, though, the bill to pay attention to, and I have a lot of respect for Senator Rand Paul here. Senator Rand Paul, in 2013, introduced a bill that we called the Do Nothing Guarantee Act. We were not fond of it. It basically said, if you have access to a Article 3 or civilian court, then you have access to an Article 3 or civilian court, which is like, okay, great, you lost that under the 2012 NDAA. But we made very specific criticisms of it. It didn't include all persons. It only included citizens. It didn't cover people if the law changed. A few other things. And he took all of those criticisms into account with his 6th Amendment Preservation Act. And right now in Congress, the 6th Amendment Preservation Act, if you call your senator, call your congressman and tell them that the 6th Amendment Preservation Act will restore the protections of the right to due process in this country, I really credit Senator Rand Paul for introducing that. Senator Mike Lee has also been very vocal about the 2012 NDAA, as well as Justin Amash, Thomas Massey, people like that. The Liberty Caucus and the Freedom Caucus. Not the Freedom Caucus. Liberty Caucus. Right. 75% of the Freedom Caucus voted voted for the 2012 NDAA. Yeah. But anyway, the people who do deserve credit. I think that the fight now is, we educated people that you should be tried in court to be called a terrorist. That we don't get to just abrogate your rights just because we think you're a terrorist. And then the next step is, let's defeat this legislation once and for all. There is that bill in action right now. Call your congressman, call your senator, reach out to them, get some coverage on that bill so that we are able to regain some of our liberties, because you never know who the executive in power is going to be.
Well, and in Canada, I mostly focus on the United States because, well, that's the heart of the.
Let's face it, you're America's hat.
Yeah, exactly. And in Canada, we have a thing called Bill C-51. It's almost the exact same thing as the NDAA, and it basically says if you question the government, you can be considered a potential terrorist, and if you're considered a potential terrorist, then that gives us the right to break down your door without any due process or warrant.
Right.
So, I mean, we see these similarities, and it's frightening because it's happening across the board. Britain has a very similar act as well, and when this is happening, we have to ask ourselves, in 20 years down the line, are we going to be happy that we sat back and did nothing, or are we going to be prouder of ourselves for at least doing everything we can in our power to change this? So I really appreciate what you do. Can you tell our viewers how they can support your work and find more of what you do?
So first of all, this movement is yours. This movement is your viewers. This movement's not mine. I had a really interesting take on it maybe, and I did a lot of work to found the organization. But in order for this to be successful, people have to take responsibility in their own communities for this movement. This is not mine. So if you want to fight back against the NDAA, there's a packet online at pandaunite.org. That's pandaunite.org. You can download that packet for your city. It contains the legislation you need, and it contains everything that you need to go to your city council, go to your county commission, and stop it. And like I said, you need to make sure that your congressmen and senators hear you, even if they don't vote in the direction you might want them to. If they're hearing from people, they're much less likely to make it even worse. And I think that's really a big deal. Support the Sixth Amendment Preservation Act. Again, you can check out pandaunite.org. Thank you so much, man.
Yeah.